So today we are pleased to welcome David Albert. David is a retired Air Force officer who has been studying the Civil War for more than 50 years. He was a Civil War docent at the Alabama Department of Archives and History for many years. I think that's fascinating because I'm an archivist by profession, so I want to hear a little bit more about that. He co-taught the Civil War elective at the Air Force Command and Staff College. He presented courses for Elderhostel and currently teaches courses at Pitt, CMU, and LaRoche in their lifelong learning programs for seniors. He is a member of the Greater Pittsburgh Civil War Roundtable and a proud graduate of Penn State, which we will not hold against him. Ladies and gentlemen, David Albert. Yes.
With only 5 tickets left, I'm surprised you haven't installed speed bumps up here. Somebody's going to get hurt afterwards. Okay, well, this talk's going to look at the Civil War from a little bit different perspective than most people do. It's not about battles. It's more about the difference in our country from pre-war to post-war Civil War. And I think you'll be amazed at some of the changes that the country went through that people don't even think about when they think of the Civil War. Again, I call it the Civil War is the watershed event in U.S. history.
David, you might have to turn that on the side, on your slide advancer.
Oh,
Side there.
good. Okay. So if we're going to talk about a watershed, we need to define what that is. And I use the definition from the Random House Dictionary of the English Language. And watershed is the point of division between places, conditions, etc. And by the end of this talk, I think you'll be able to agree very easily with the statement that the Civil War was the watershed event in American history. Well, using that definition, I think most people who look at the changes wrought by or advanced by the events of 1861 to 1865 will agree that the Civil War was indeed this country's watershed event. And that's pretty clear, since to paraphrase Mark Twain, after he had toured the South, everyone else dates things from the birth of Christ, the South from the Civil War. And having lived in Alabama for 15 years, I can attest to that. The elimination of slavery and the social, economic, and political changes that time produced, the changes in the status of women, the creation of a nation that henceforth would be viewed as a single entity and a great power, the advancements in medicine, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, and banking, the industrialization and urbanization of the South, the changes in the prosecution of war itself, and the shift in power from the states to the federal government all resulted from these climactic 4 years in one way or another, either directly or indirectly. And Americans weren't the only ones to recognize the significance of these events. In Europe, John Stuart Mill, a philosopher, said the American War is destined to be a turning point for good or evil in the course of human affairs. And he expressed what many people around the world were probably thinking when he said that. So let's look a little bit more closely at some of these changes and their significance in our history and our heritage. Now, the years 1776 to 1783 created our country. while the years 1861 to 1865 preserved that nation from destruction and really determined in large part what that nation would become. The Civil War settled two important fundamental issues that the founding fathers somehow had left unresolved when they wrote the Constitution of 1789. The first of these was, would the United States be a nation with a sovereign national government or a dissoluble confederation of sovereign states? And second, would a country born of a declaration that all men are created equal continue to exist as the world's largest slaveholding country? Well, it turns out, in fact, that the country would emerge from the war as a single united nation, a union indissoluble and governed by a central sovereign national government. Prior to the war, the United States took a plural verb, as in the United States are. After the war, the United States took a singular verb, as in the United States is. Now, that may seem like a very small change, but it really speaks volumes about the difference in the country before and after the war. That didn't mean that the states wouldn't still have inputs to the government, but it did mean that there were certain powers or rights that the states wouldn't have, and one of those was the right to secede. The war destroyed the Old South. It transformed the Union that it preserved and shaped many of the institutions of modern America. Now, this second issue was also unequivocally answered by the war. With Lincoln's formal announcement of his Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January, 1863, the future of slavery was sealed. No longer would it be left to the vagaries of territorial expansion, whether in soil erosion, or even the will of the citizens of newly acquired states, the idea of popular sovereignty. The peculiar institution was eliminated in one dramatic act. While it would still take another 100 years for the nation to truly adopt the idea and the intent of this revolutionary document in some places, it ensured that, in fact, the country would not continue to exist as the largest slaveholding country in the world. Prior to the Civil War, prior to 1861, Russia was the largest slaveholding country in the world. But they eliminated slavery in Russia in 1861, and that left the United States as the largest slaveholding country in the world. Aside from answering these two questions, what were some of the other things that the war did? Well, one of the biggest changes in government produced by the war, and one of the things the South seceded over, was the dramatic shift in power. Dramatic shift in power from the states to the federal government. Yet one scholar has concluded that despite their firmly held rights beliefs, states' rights beliefs, which if you talk to people in the South, and if you talk about the Civil War, almost to a person, they'll say, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. But Southerners were compelled by wartime exigencies to increase the powers of the central government to beyond what was originally intended. And in this ongoing process, a change in their own government evolved that bore a striking resemblance to the government that they chose to secede from. For instance, the Davis government instituted conscription. They established price controls on government contractors. They seized and managed the railroads. And all of these things were the same things that the Union government was doing at this time. It also impressed needed items from the citizens, things such primarily as manufactured goods, like wagons and harnesses, food, slave labor, and again, food and forage were some of the things that were most impressed. If we look at the amendments of the Constitution, I'm a little bit behind on my slides. 11 of the first 12 amendments were aimed at limiting the power of the federal government. But beginning in 1865 with the adoption of the 13th Amendment, 6 of the next 7 amendments were designed to expand the federal government's power at the expense of the states. The only exception being the 17th Amendment, which gave the states the power to replace senators. So if a senator dies, the state government, usually the governor, is the one that gets to appoint their replacement. For the longest time, the only contact that the federal government had with the average citizen was through the post office. Suddenly, they were being governed from Washington by an entity that taxed them, drafted them into the Army, created paper money and a national bank, and created the first national agency for social welfare, the Freedmen's Bureau. In terms of taxes, in August 1861, the federal government imposed an income tax on the population and created an internal, or as my father used to say, infernal, revenue bureau to collect it. It was initially set at 3% of income greater than $800, which is about $27,000 in today's money. Eventually, it was later raised to 3% of income between $600 and $10,000 and 5% of income over $10,000. Eventually, it went to 5% between $600 and $10,000 and 10% over $10,000. And I think any one of us in here would probably be pleased to be paying taxes at that rate today. This newly empowered federal government also created and imposed excise taxes, inheritance taxes, and value-added taxes on the citizenry. It also came up with the idea of selling bonds in order to finance the war. And this was kind of the forerunner to the huge bond sales of World War I and World War II. Some of us in here may remember the bond sales of World War II. Now in banking, this new central government also created and issued paper money for the first time. In February of 1862, the Northern Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the issuance of $150 million in greenbacks or treasury notes, which is the money form that we still use today. If you discount things like blockchain and Bitcoin and those other things, and if you're smart, I think you do discount those, but that's just a personal opinion. In February 1863, the same Congress passed the National Bank Act, recreating a U.S. bank, which remained the backbone of the American monetary system until 1913, when the Federal Reserve System superseded it. If you remember your American history, you'll remember that Andrew Jackson, when he was president, refused to renew the charter of the Second National Bank, and then the following year withdrew all federal funds from it. So this was a big thing, recreating the bank. In terms of wealth distribution, the war also radically altered the distribution of wealth throughout the nation. And of course, in the South, this was largely the result of freeing the slaves, because that's where most of the South's wealth lay prior to the war. In 1860, the average per capita wealth of Southern whites was 95% higher than that of Northern whites. But by 1870, the average per capita wealth of Northern whites was 44% higher than that of Southern whites. Another statistic that shows this radical shift in wealth distribution was that in 1860, the South's share of the national wealth had been 30%. By 1870, it was only 12%. That's a significant drop. So economically, when you're talking about taxes, banking, and wealth distribution, the country was definitely a far different place after the war than it was before the war. Again, I'm a little slow on my slides, sorry. The status of women. I see we've got a few in here, so this is important, I think. The war also changed the status of women, raising it tremendously. The Civil War feminized the workplace. There was a 40% increase in the number of women working in manufacturing, particularly producing textiles, shoes, and garment making. There were also large increases in the number of female teachers and government civil service workers. In the South, women had to handle most of the jobs that the men had been doing prior to the war, especially in agriculture. If you've seen the movie Cold Mountain, Renee Zellweger's Oscar-winning role in that pretty clearly and accurately depicts the additional responsibilities that women had to take on when their men were either drafted or joined the army. Women volunteer nurses advanced the status of nurses as a profession. Prior to that, nursing had been considered a menial job. As a result, more training programs and new nursing schools were started. In fact, on the northern side, a female surgeon, Dr. Mary Walker, was the first woman to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. If you think about it, the Civil War was really the beginning of the women's rights movement. And it's a little interesting about Dr. Walker, because after she was awarded her medal, Congress then later decided that they ought to take it back. People have asked me why, and I think it was because she was a woman, but she refused to give it back, which is kind of interesting, and hung on to it. And in 1973, Jimmy Carter decided to reinstate it. So she kept it in the end legally. But it really was the start of the women's rights movement. In agriculture, agriculture was also greatly impacted by the war. While the 1850s had been a decade of rapid mechanization in grain farming, the war greatly expanded the use of mechanized machinery like reapers and mowers to make up for the loss of manpower to the armies. Because again, most of the people at that time, most of the young men were on farms. They were living on farms, they were working on farms. And so when you take away all of that manpower to the armies, they had to make up for it in some way. And the way they did it was by producing more of these machines that would allow fewer people to do the same jobs. The production of these machines actually tripled during the war. Even though 1/3 of the farm labor force was in the army, the North was able to produce more wheat in 1862 and 1863 than the entire country had produced in the record-setting year of 1859. The North even doubled its exports of wheat, corn, pork, and beef to Europe during the war. Now, this didn't represent a revolution. The agricultural revolution actually had taken place some 10 to 20 years earlier than that. But it was rather a war-induced acceleration of pre-war trends in agricultural mechanization. Now, in the primarily agricultural South, the production of cotton, tobacco, and hemp dropped precipitously with the shift in agriculture from those products, money products, to food production. That became the big thing. For example, the Savannah Daily News reported that Georgia's cotton production went from 700,000 bales in 1861 to 60,000 bales in 1862. That's an enormous drop. The view was that every acre devoted to non-edibles was an acre wasted, especially after the Union blockade tightened and greatly limited the exportation of money crops to Europe. In fact, some state governments actually limited the acreage of crops that could be put in tobacco and cotton by law. Now, the same kind of acceleration that took place in agricultural modernization also took place in food processing. Canned fruit, canned fruits and vegetables, for example, went from 5 million cans annually before the war to 30 million cans a year in the 1860s. Condensed milk was an even more amazing story. Gail Borden opened his first plant in 1859. Northern Army contracts expanded the production of condensed milk to 17,000 quarts a month by the summer of 1862. And a year later, that 17,000 quarts a month represented one day's production. Instant mashed potatoes and desiccated vegetables also made their appearance during the war. Although the soldiers usually referred to those as desecrated vegetables. And if you're like me, you probably thought that instant mashed potatoes were created by Swanson for TV dinners during the 1950s. That's what I always thought anyway. Now, in manufacturing, in the North, manufacturing, especially that involving arms and clothing, likewise boomed. This was the first extensive use of the American system of mass production for the manufacture of military goods. While ready-made clothes were available pre-war, thanks to the invention of the sewing machine in 1846, the demand for uniforms helped double the number of sewing machines in use between 1860 and 1865. Standard sizes were created, which would be used in producing civilian wear after the war. Prior to the war, you couldn't walk into a men's warehouse and say, I'd like a 40 regular and a 3-piece suit, please. Didn't work that way. Just like with the soldiers, when they were issued uniforms, they were thrown whatever happened to be on top usually, and because there was no established formal tailoring operations set up, they did their own, what's the word I'm looking for? Come on, ladies, help me out here. Thank you, alterations. Wait till you get to be my age. Sympathize. The mechanization of shoe production jumped as the Army demand for shoes increased, and many of the North's skilled shoemakers joined or were drafted into the Army. By the end of 1863, sewing machines capable of stitching soles to uppers had been produced, and they had produced 2.5 million pairs of shoes. Additionally, 2.5 million small arms were produced by Northern weapons manufacturers during the war. Now, in the South, behind here. In the South, Confederate manufacturers accomplished little short of an industrial revolution. The Ordnance Bureau was under the extremely capable direction of Josiah Gorgas, who led the government's efforts at industrialization, revitalizing or building arsenals and armories throughout the South. If you want to really read the full extent of this really manufacturing miracle that Josiah Gorgas presided over, you read a book by Frank Van Diver entitled Plowshares to Swords. Swords, yeah, plowshares to swords, thank you. Now, the government took the buildings, for instance, and bought the land around them and created the giant Augusta Powder Works in Augusta, Georgia, which became the largest nationally owned factory system in the world at that time. Mississippi offers one great example of the manufacturing stimulus of the war. By 1863, Pemberton's 30,000-man army that was defending Vicksburg had existed almost exclusively from clothing and equipment manufactured in Mississippi. Of course, all of that ended in the summer of 1863 when Grant captured Vicksburg. But Mississippi had been primarily, almost exclusively agricultural prior to the Civil War. And now it was able to supply a 30,000-man army with state-made goods. textile mills, shoe factories, and other industries developed across the Confederacy and were the beginnings of the industrial South that exists today. And with this industrialization came urbanization. Overwhelmingly rural, the South in 1860 had only one city ranked in the top 10 in the country in population. Anybody want to take a guess?
Richmond?
Not Richmond, that's what you would think. New Orleans, good, exactly. Or they'd say it Nolens. Nolens, N-A-W-L-I-N-S, Nolens. But thanks to the war, by 1863, tiny Selma, Alabama, which just got hit by a serious tornado, it's destroyed an awful lot of the town there in Selma. But Selma, Alabama employed over 10,000 people in its war industries. And places like Columbus, Atlanta, and Macon all became large industrial centers in Georgia. Besides industrialization, other factors associated with the war led to the creation and expansion of southern cities. Armies flocked to the cities as places to be defended, but also as recruitment and training centers. And of course, the soldiers being there attracted others. For instance, the vast majority of military hospitals were located in urban areas, which drew doctors, nurses, aides, cooks, and family members, many of these people who decided to stay after the war was over. For example, the Confederates established several hospitals in Richmond, including the huge Chimborazo Hospital, which became the largest such facility in the world for a while. Refugees from the countryside, subject to northern occupation, sought refuge in the cities, where greater safety existed than in the rural areas, which were usually less heavily defended. Well, in terms of medical care, James McPherson said the Civil War was fought at the end of the medical Middle Ages, and that was very, very true. There were numerous important advances in medicine and medical care resulting from the war, from advancements in surgery and prosthetic limbs to the recognition of the importance of sanitation. This is when scientists were starting to make the connection between disease and bacteria and cleanliness. And this was going to go a long way in decreasing the number of men that died of disease. One interesting thing about the prosthetic limbs, does anybody recall the first land battle of the Civil War? Philippi, yeah, or Philippi as I pronounce it. Exactly. Very small battle in terms of Civil War battles, but there were 2 Confederate soldiers at that battle that were wounded badly enough that they had to have their leg amputated. And one of them was a man by the name of Hanger. And the Hanger Company still exists today and is probably the largest manufacturer of artificial limbs today. So that was something he made his own. The way he started his company was after he had his leg cut off, he made his own prosthetic leg using barrel staves. And from there, created this company that still exists. A Northern Ambulance Corps established in 1862 and mandated by Congress in 1864 became the model for most armies in the world up until World War I, along with the hospital system, both set up by the Union Medical Director, Dr. Jonathan Letterman. A system of triage was developed, and the first hospital ship, the Red Rover, was built and used. Specially configured train cars were created for the transport of the wounded by rail. For instance, after Gettysburg, wounded were very, very rapidly shipped off to other hospitals around the northern area. And one hardcore example would be on July 9th. There were over 1,000 wounded soldiers moved from the Gettysburg area to Baltimore by train. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, a civilian volunteer organization created in 1861 by the first, it was created in 1861 by the first woman to graduate from U.S. medical school, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. It helped the Army Medical Bureau care for the soldiers, and it became a model for post-war philanthropy. Let me go back a second, sorry. Its importance was expressed by a Union surgeon at Gettysburg, who, when seeing the U.S. Sanitary Commission wagons starting to arrive, even while the battle was still going on, reportedly said, "Thank God, here comes the Sanitary Commission. Now we shall be able to get something done." It also served as the model for the American Public Health Association, founded in 1872, which was so important in the subsequent modernization of American medicine and public health. And then the nature of war itself was changed. It saw the development of joint operations, for instance, between services. There was and still is an ongoing, I would say, combative attitude between the services, and it usually has to do with money allocation. But they started joint operations during the Civil War. Probably the best example of that was when Admiral David Porter worked with Grant in the Vicksburg campaign. That was really a perfect example of joint operations and inter-service cooperation. Other places like Port Royal, Cape Hatteras, and the campaigns to take Fort Donelson and Fort Henry also were joint operations. The North also saw the creation of the first Army Chief of Staff position, which was filled by Henry Halleck. And that's a position that still exists in the Army today. It also saw the first extensive use of railroads and telegraphs for military purposes. Saw the first use of observation balloons. And it also saw the first interface or interaction between ironclad vessels. That was in the spring of 1862 when the Monitor met the Merrimack there in Hampton Roads. It also witnessed the first instance of submarine warfare with the USS, the CSS Hundley. Weapons-wise, the war saw the first extensive use of rifled weapons, primitive machine guns, and breech loading and repeating rifles. It also saw the first limited use of landmines that occurred during the Peninsula Campaign. And Joseph Johnston, once he found out that soldiers were using those, outlawed them. He wouldn't allow his armies to use them anymore because he said they were so inhumane. And yet, almost 200 years later, we haven't learned a thing from that. These in turn led to radical changes in tactics and eventually to the trench warfare that was a precursor to the trench warfare that we saw in World War I. And a lot of these changes in the tactics were actually brought about by the soldiers themselves, particularly after battles like Gettysburg, when they soon realized that marching in closely compacted lines, shoulder to shoulder across empty fields against entrenched defenders using repeating rifles in some cases, or at least rifled weapons, was basically suicide. And so whenever they'd stop, the soldiers after that tended to start digging in. All of these resulted in the incredible lethality, which produced over 750,000 dead from combat and disease. And it also saw the advent of total war, whose best protagonist of that, I guess, would be William Tecumseh Sherman. And I use the number 750,000. I think a lot of people are still thinking 622,000. But several years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a historian using census data from 1860, comparing it to 1870, decided that 622,000 deaths during the war wasn't nearly enough. And he calculated that it was probably closer to 750,000, which is a total now that James McPherson accepts. And since I consider him one of the best Civil War historians still writing, that's the number I'm using now. And finally, in politics, the makeup of the government itself changed as a result of the war. From 1789 to 1861, a Southern slaveholder was president 2/3 of the time. 2/3 of the speakers of the House and presidents pro tem of the Senate had also been Southerners up to the Civil War. 20 of the 35 Supreme Court justices were from the South during that time, which always had a Southern majority on the court until 1861. After the war, it would be another half century before another Southerner was elected president. Remember who that was? No? Thank you. From Virginia. Everybody kind of thinks of Woodrow Wilson as a Northerner, I think, but yeah, who is from Virginia? For half a century, none of the speakers or presidents pro tem were from the South, and only 5 of 26 Supreme Court justices appointed during that time were from the South. Welcome page here, just a second. Okay. So, in terms of politics, the war really did change political parties and who had the power. And it's interesting, if you look at the situation in the United States today, it's reversed 180% from what it was shortly after the war, where you had a solid Democratic South and a Republican North. Excuse me, a Republican South and a solid Democratic North. And then in the 1900s, it switched to be a solid Democratic South, Republican North. Now, who knows what it is? I give up trying to figure it out anymore. Well, the Civil War was the watershed event in American history. McPherson wrote, "The institutions and ideology of a plantation society and a caste system that had dominated half the country pre-1861 and sought to dominate more went down in a great crash in 1865. And the flames were forged, in the flames were forged the framework of modern America. For America was indeed a watershed, a turning point as dramatic as anything seen before or since. A Louisiana planter returning home in 1863 sadly wrote, "Society has been completely changed by the war. The French Revolution did not produce a greater change in the ancien regime than this has in our own social life." And finally, 4 years later, a Harvard professor concluded that the Civil War had created a great gulf between what happened before in our century and what has happened since, or what is likely to happen hereafter. It does not seem to me as if I were living in the same country in which I were born. I kind of feel like that myself today. So I hope that I've convinced you through this rather brief talk that indeed those 4 years from 1861 to 1865 were indeed a watershed event in our country's history. Anybody has any questions? I'll be willing to try to take them. Yes.
There's two halves of the country, and certainly there's a trade amongst them. With this split, was there, I mean, like, for example, cotton, where did the North get their cotton? Did they increase the number of ships going over to Europe? How was that affected?
Well, one thing that happened is once Grant captured Vicksburg and the Mississippi was completely controlled shortly thereafter by the North, the Midwest had a lot of problems shipping their food stuffs and other farm materials out to Europe because they used to use the Mississippi River as their export point. And actually what that did was it kind of stifled talk that had been arising of some kind of a Midwestern Confederacy, because the Midwest at that point was starting to think that the Northeast was pretty much controlling things. As far as cotton went, I think that first of all, they reduced by so much the cotton production that they were keeping most of it at home, I believe. And maybe the Union was substituting wool or some other fabric for cotton. But they weren't sending much of it to England. England had actually stockpiled a bit of cotton prior to the war to deal with just such a contingency, as well as starting to get cotton from places like Egypt. So that's about as well as I can answer that. Yes.
Majority of wealth was in the South prior to
Yes,
the war, significant majority.
right.
What was the but I would think majority population was in the North.
Yes, it was. It was 3-1.
Three to
And
one.
almost.
And-
22 million in the north, 9 million in the south.
And make that point that the economics of slaveholding is why that, but it sounds like just to simplify. Because all the stuff you made it sound like, geez, it's more a good thing, look how we advanced here and all these things. I know that wasn't your point, but because of the larger population in the north, there were enough people to do all these manufacturing, et cetera, advances.
Exactly.
Um,
And again, once the slaves were freed, they were no longer considered property, so you couldn't consider them as well. And so that was a big decrease in the South wealth
Okay.
during the war, after the war. Yes.
Just a weird question on kind of the statistics.
Oh, we're done.
Yeah, well,
You're free.
and we can go, the 9 million population in the South, was that including, slaves?
Yeah.
Since they weren't.
They were,
Yeah, they were about 2 million, 2.5 million of that 9 million population. And because of that, because they weren't used slaves in the army, gave them a much smaller male, mid-range age population to draw from.
Can I get you to go back up there by
your
microphones?
sorry.
Sorry.
This is why I don't do Zoom. I hate to be tied to a podium and a microphone, which is why I stumbled over a lot of stuff. Yes.
You mentioned in your talk that taxes were introduced in 1861 and a banking system. Would it be understood that that applied only to the North? Because I can't imagine that the government was getting taxes from the South.
No, you're right. It was only by the federal government in the North, although I think the South also instituted some taxes. And along with the impressment of farm produce and so on and manufactured goods, put quite a bit of stress on the regular people in the South. You had things like bread riots. They had a huge bread riot in Richmond in 1863, I think, because there wasn't enough bread available and so on. So they were short of an awful lot of things once the Union blockade tightened and they weren't able to import goods from Europe. Okay. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I think you make a very convincing case that the Civil War is the watershed event in U.S. history.
Thank you.
Setting aside the revolutions, who would come in second or third place, depending on how we get the revolution out? I'm thinking maybe World War II.
That's what I would say. I would definitely say it. And I have been, the past year, I've read about probably 30 books. With COVID, all I do anymore is read and go to the gym. But I've probably read 30 books on the war, the Second World War, both in the Pacific and Europe. And in terms of the changes that war wrought in our country, I would definitely say that was probably the second most important military action. Yes.
Talk about the role of the income tax. Does that impose mainly on individuals or on corporations?
No, I think it was on individuals. Now, they did away with that after the war for a while because I think it was the 17th Amendment that was passed in 1913, I believe, was the thing that established the income tax system that we have now, the start of it, formally. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One view, military installations in the South today. Now, many of them are named after Confederate generals, or Hood, or Lee, or Bragg.
Right.
Was that a conscious attempt to reunite the country? You know, draw the Southern whites in the military, you know, make them feel like they're part of the U.S.
Yeah. I'm not sure it was, because I don't think a lot of those monuments and things, oh, well, you're talking about base namings. I don't know, that might have been. Yeah, that might have been, but you're absolutely right. They're changing an awful lot of those now. In fact, there's one in Alabama, Fort Rucker, which is the Army's helicopter training base. And they are renaming that for a guy from Georgia, I think it was from Georgia, who was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. I got to meet him when I was stationed in Alabama. His name, it's going to be sorry, mental block here, but it's a little short. Oh, Novacell, Chief Novacell, little short guy like this who.
My second question is, we hear so much today about how the country is divided along red, blue, conservative, liberal, pro-abortion, anti-abortion.
Right.
And they always refer to this as most divisive we've been in the country since the Civil War. Is there any way you could quantify that? I mean, we don't have rules that are going on very often.
No.
Meetings in Congress.
No, that's true, but you have people carrying guns in Congress now, which they've never allowed before. I think it's pretty divisive. Could I quantify it? No, I couldn't, but there's probably somebody that could.
Shouting on TV screen, a panel is different than.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
Virginia is going to defend their borders against the barbarians in the north.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe it's just, you know.
Well, a lot of it also is you see it every day and hear it every day. Yeah, exactly. Any other? Yes.
I have a question. It doesn't have to do what you presented today, but I think you must know a lot of background history about the South before the Civil War. I read a couple of references where in the 1840s, 1850s, a couple of Southern men wrote books that were banned in the South because they claimed that most white people in the South were financially worse off with slavery than the South. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know enough about it to give you other than what I think, but I'm not an expert on that part. But I think Southern whites, since only about 20% of the white people in the South owned slaves at all, and only a handful, well, 5% maybe owned 20 or more slaves, which exempted them from military service. So I would think that a lot of them did feel poorer because of that. The kinds of books that were written, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the biggie. The people in the South absolutely hated that book because they thought it depicted a terribly inappropriate depiction of the South. And yet that book was the largest selling book in the country when the year it was published. It was the largest selling book in England, if you can believe that, the year it was published. So I'm sure there was some of that. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned toward the top of your talk that the shift between the United States is, the United States are. Was that a formal thing, or is that more of like a sentiment thing, or
No,
One moment where they changed it?
yeah, that's a good question. No, I don't think it was ever a formal thing, but I think just through use, through the public using it. And that may have actually been something that the people in the North particularly tried to use to maybe bring the country back together. They went, but they did, they started writing now as the United States is. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out.
Everyone, remember next month, we're back here, February 11th at the Smithmire. If anyone who's interested in tickets for the pavilion, you can see me today, 5 here to go to the next month. And if you come up, that's love here. Thanks for coming, everyone.